Heartily welcome everybody and good evening. Warm welcome to Amesbury House, which is the name of this house, which is also the ambassador's residence here in London. And thank you all for joining us for panel discussion on safeguarding cultural heritage in a shifting climate, discussions on sustainable preservation and risk mitigation. Thank you to the Norwegian company Bevart, who has initiated and put together this evening's fantastic panel. It promises to be an engaging evening as we explore the critical themes of sustainability and efficiency in protecting cultural heritage. Norway and the UK share a long history of shared cultural heritage. In the early days, it was perhaps more focused on plundering than conservation, and I'm sorry about that. It has luckily changed. The question to be discussed this evening concerns how cultural heritage should be preserved, which parts of it should be preserved, and not least, who decides what is to be preserved. Since art and cultural objects cross national borders, it is natural that the discussion take place in international forums. Before I give the word to Bevart, I would also like to say a few words about this building, as I know many of you have an interest in architecture and history. This building was built in 1905. It was designed by a Scottish architect, Edward John May. It is owned by Crown Estate, and it has been the Norwegian ambassador's residence since 1936. Amesbury House has an important historical value for Norway, as this house, 10 Palace Green, was King Haakon VII's base during the Second World War. You might remember that we were occupied by Nazi Germany and that the royal family had to escape from Norway and got the protection from the British people here in the UK, and that was the same with the legitimate government of Norway, so the exile government also operated here in London. And the cabinet meetings were held each Friday morning in the dining room where you're actually sitting now. At the table, which is actually not here now, but it's one floor up. So a very important sort of emotional place for us. It was also in the dining room, this room, that the king on the 8th of May 1945 formally declared the liberation of Norway. Now it is time for me to give the word to Christian Nielsen, operation manager at Bevart, and an art historian who will guide us through this evening's program. So the floor is yours, Christian.
Thank you, Ambassador, for the warm introduction, and at least for hosting us in this remarkable venue, steeped in history. Good evening, everyone. I'm deeply honored to be here tonight, representing both our company, Bevart, and joining such an esteemed group of professionals and enthusiasts dedicated to the preservation of cultural heritage. When we first started working in this field, I was an art history student back then. About 3 years ago, we were struck by the openness and the helpfulness we met from the conservators when we first started venturing into that world. We were inquiring about what was working and what was not working in the way things were being done when it came to environmental monitoring. And boy, did we get answers. From someone in this room here today. Her name is Lynn Solheim at the back. She helped us enormously. She set us in touch with all the other conservators in Norway and really gave us a kickstart on how to build something that the industry wants and needs. So we are very thankful for that. But not only did we get answers, we were also told who to contact next. So after a while, we were told that the person you really want to talk to, his name is Boris Pretzel. And we got in touch with him, and we were having some video conversations for about a year's time while he was lecturing in Japan. And I'm very proud to say that we've met him for the first time physically yesterday, together with his wife. And not only is he an expert in what he has done, but he's also a very pleasant colleague. So I'm very happy to call him my colleague. So I'll quickly get done. We have been attending these conservation conferences for quite some while now, following in the footsteps of giants. And all of these conferences are very scientific based. The lectures are serious, they are long, there are plenty of footnotes. We want to do the exact opposite tonight. So which is why we challenged our panelists to hold their introductions in 5 minutes without using any visual aids, no PowerPoints, no nothing. And I'm very confident that they will really deliver. And I'm excited to try at least to deliver something else than what the conferences often do. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you for my team. Thank you to the embassy staff and to Innovation Norway for helping us hosting this. And thank you as well to the technicians in the back. Thanks a lot. I hope you have a lovely evening. I'll see you around.
Thank you, Christian. I'm Boris Pretzel, and I don't know what to say after that introduction, but I feel like this is an evening amongst friends, so I think we are all friends. I hope we have some challenging debate coming forwards, but it's going to be a friendly debate, and I am very, very honored to be sharing the stage with this very distinguished panel. I will spend 2 seconds introducing them all. I'm going to give you the names. You have their biography in the program, and much, much more online. I'm going to start, I think, in the order in which I met them and then how much influence they've had on my life. So I have to start with Jonathan Ashley Smith, who made one big mistake in his life. He employed me. And I thought he employed me because I was clever and managed to dupe the V&A into thinking I was a chemist, even though I'm not. More of that later. But in fact, he employed me because we went to the same university, which I didn't know. So he put me in my place by saying, no, it's not you, it's just that you're a Bristolian like myself. The next person, I think I'm going to do it in the right order, I think the next person I met in this very distinguished panel is Stefan Michalski, who put his head through a painting in 1993, something I shall never forget. And that's why he's going to start the debate in a minute about how do we choose what we conserve. The next person in the order that I met them, so these were all within my first decade of being involved in conservation, was Stefan Simon, who I met when he was actually at the Getty back in 2003, perhaps. 2001, well, there you go, yeah, okay. And Stefan has moved on to many, many things. He is primarily, I'm going to give him a microphone in a minute, but he is primarily the director of the Ratkin Forschungslabor in Berlin, the oldest scientific laboratory dedicated to the conservation and preservation of art. So a fantastic position. In the interim, while he has been there, he has also been at Yale at the Institute for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage, on a sabbatical, as it were, for a mere 5 years. But he's back at the Ratkin where he belongs. He's a member of the ICCROM Council, or has been. He has done many, many distinguished positions. And I'm relying on Stefan putting a slightly different perspective on what we're going to be talking about tonight. So Stefan, the spotlight's on you to be controversial. Not that that's good. Next in the line has got to be Jane, because Jane and I met, I guess it was about 2001 as well. We'd probably met before at ICOM conferences, but we started working together sort of on a more serious level in about 2005 when we were both in the Preventive Conservation Working Group of ICOM-CC, and I was delighted that Jane remained a trusted colleague when I took over the role as coordinator. And Jane, you still doing that, or you finished now? You're only allowed to do it for like 5 terms, and if you lie, you can do it for another 2. Each term is 3 years, so Jane did, I guess, at least 15 years. In the mid-2000s, I also was very privileged to meet Julie, who's from the computer science department in Imperial College, but she's not really from the computer science department at all. She pretends to be a chemist. At least that's how I met her. I thought she was a chemist, so I thought she duped me like I duped the DNA. But she is a computer scientist, has some wonderful students, has done a lot of work on networks, neural networks, is an expert on things like artificial intelligence, so we'll be relying on her to tell us about what's around the corner and what's in store for us, and do we still need to struggle with things that we are struggling with now. Before we start, I've got a hand, the last microphone. Ooh, sorry. Stefan. The order, we set some questions. I'm not going to tell you what the questions were, but we set some questions, and we sort of randomly picked who we wanted to address different elements of the questions, and that then defined the order of the presentations. Please do not read anything into the order that they will be given. But opening today's debate will be Stefan Michalski, who's got 5 minutes to introduce himself and give some positioning statement on why he are locals that we are in the first place.
Oh, Mr. Ambassador, Boris, Christian, ladies and gentlemen, I was given some very difficult questions, which I thought would be 3 or 4 PhD theses to answer. We all were. We were all very polite and didn't respond back saying, crazy. You really want us to be superficial, so okay. In 5 minutes, I'm going to give my answers to questions, but I will tell you what the questions are in order, and you can think about what your answer might be. So why is conservation important? My answer, I'm going to start by defining what we do. As many philosophers have pointed out recently, you're trying to understand an idea or a concept or whatever, you go to the actions, what it is we actually do when we're doing that stuff. And I think we are the mechanics of authenticity of heritage things. So we're the mechanics, like car mechanics, yes, that's what I mean, of authenticity of heritage things. And authenticity will be the key concept in my comments. The next question is what gets preserved and who decides? Well, my short answer is to the conservators in this room, it's not our expertise, it's not our job description. We are part of the general public in answering the question of what gets conserved. My understanding of the gatekeepers is that traditionally has been curators or the museum as a system. And we all know that this is now opening up to diverse communities, the end of neocolonialism, et cetera, et cetera. And there'll be more about communities from other speakers after me. Next question was how to assess the value of heritage things. For example, are fine arts, decorative arts, applied arts, and ephemera, are these different things in terms of assessing value? My short answer is fundamentally no. These things all acquire value due to their authenticity. So the other part of the short answer is how do you find out the value of things is you ask people. You ask the community. Bottom line, when you're asking a community, you're asking people and their representatives and their stakeholders. And the one thing I did learn in trying to do risk assessment and assigning different values is that we don't need to get caught up in absolute value. We're talking about relative value. How many rusty nails is this Rembrandt painting worth in terms of would you carry out 10 million rusty nails for a fire or one Rembrandt painting? I think most people know that we're looking at lots of zeros on that ratio, but we've never been allowed to actually admit that in conservation in the past. So my sense is that perceived value depends on 2 parts to authenticity. The first part is what I would call origins. That is, first of all, who made it? Or if you don't know that, if it's just an ancient person 6,000 years ago who made some of the glorious ivory figurines in the British Museum, then it was when and where. But it's still, we connect those things because we can imagine, we know that a human being thousands of years ago made those. The second part of authenticity that gets our profession in a twist is appearance today. So authenticity comes from what we know about the origins of the object, and then it's also about, is the appearance authentic? And these 2 judgments involve 2 parts of our thinking, So those of you who've read Kahneman's book on slow and fast thinking, or what used to be called the subconscious versus the conscious, or the irrational versus the rational, or the subjective versus the objective. We take a whole philosophy course to say what the subtle differences are between all of those, but roughly speaking. I like Jonathan Haidt's analogy is that in our minds, the two sides, we have an elephant who has beliefs and is slow moving and very difficult to steer. And we have a rational rider on top of that elephant that lives in the delusion that they are actually steering the elephant to where it wants to go. And they just have to say to the elephant, no, no, you don't want to vote for Trump, you really want to vote for a liberal. And the elephant's like, no. So let's apply these two kinds of authenticity and two kinds of thinking to an example. I was in the National Gallery in the Rembrandt room yesterday. The first painting was labeled as previously attributed to Rembrandt, but not anymore. Well, they didn't phrase it that way, but it boiled down to that. So they hadn't actually decided to take it away. It's just like the opening to the Rembrandt exhibit was, we thought this was the real thing, but it's not. But it's still interesting. My elephant just went poof. The authenticity, the magic of the Rembrandt painting, authorized and legitimized by the experts in art history and the provenance and the museum. And the museum's big function is to establish that trust. That just evaporated. So origin is incredibly important. It has nothing to do with whether it's a great painting, highly damaged painting, whatever. It's just the origin story. And then should a conservator spend hundreds of hours caring for it like a real Rembrandt? Obviously not. And this is not a value judgment open to discussion, to finesse, to text. It's pretty much an on-off switch. And when you ask people and show people something that in fact is a replica, not everyone, but large numbers of people use words like betrayed when they learn that what they're looking at in the museum is not the real thing. Now, the authenticity of appearance, we all know, is a minefield. Again, we were asked to address these minefields. Well, why? Fundamentally, it's because any restorer that helps the appearance, so is trying to rebuild the authenticity of the appearance, is of necessity damaging the authenticity of origin because they're adding new origins. They're adding the conservator's contribution, the infills, etc. So it's always going to be in conflict between those two forms of authenticity. Now, if we move on to an ephemeral object in the last minute, in the old days, you get an invitation to an embassy, and it was a gorgeous piece of paper and gold lettering and script. And I have an email in here which will allow me to get through security if necessary. And a very nice icon of the Norwegian Embassy at the top of the thing. It's still trying to look like a letter rather than an email or a PDF. We can't help that. But suppose in 100 years this meeting becomes known in the history of conservation as incredibly formative and a breakthrough in the thinking about our profession, and somebody says, I have the invitation from St. Jonathan. He actually received this. It's his name that's on this. The aura of that 100-year-old saint from our field would be part of the experience. And somebody else's, my invitation, but it's just another invitation, but the one for Jonathan. Now that's that kind of ephemeral but real authenticity, or aura, some of the French deconstructionists might get into, is about our understanding and our belief that Jonathan touched it. Last week I was going through online eBay forum on a ticket to the theater where President Lincoln was assassinated, and you don't want to believe how much that ticket is going for. It's a substantial sum of money, and money is as good a proxy for value as anything else. So I'm going to stop there. I hope I threw out some ideas to be addressed. And heritage institutions are the arbiter of authenticity. We're the mechanics. The rest of the museum system legitimizes and gives you the authenticity of the origin. What's been wrong in the past is the equity. Who were the stakeholders? Was it the European elites? And were they interested in other people's perspective? It doesn't change other people's around the world. The authenticity instinct is universal across humans. We just conceive of it differently, what plugs into it. But the feeling that that's the real thing, it's precious, it's mine, it's symbolic, it's incredibly important. I'm reverential to it. Those are all universal. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. It's interesting. I remember, Jonathan, you talking about seeing, it's the wild boar in Florence and admiring it until you found out it was not the real thing.
That's right. Yeah.
I remember that very well. So that follows on quite nicely from what you were saying about authenticity, Stefan, and how authenticity is so important. I question, and I think we will discuss later on, the link between value and financial value. It's a very good modelling thing. It's a very good simplification of our ideas. Is it correct? I'm not sure. Because I'm not sure that things equate, that money and quality and authenticity roll up into what makes Leonardo painting worth 50 million, 500 million, sorry, 50 million last week, pounds. Jonathan, with that, can I please turn the microphone to you?
You can.
To tell us all about preserving cultural heritage and giving your introduction and your statement.
Okay, well, thanks, Stefan, for sanctifying me. And I have to correct something that Boris said in his very brief introduction of me, which was I didn't hire him because we went to the same university. I just could not resist hiring someone whose name was Boris Pretzel. And to summarise what Boris didn't say, I've been involved in the field of cultural heritage now for a little longer than 50 years, 30 at the National Museum, 20 as a freelance, and more recently just sitting around waiting to be invited to gigs like this one. Well, not just sitting around, I've been studying and writing about uncertainty and conservation. As a scientist, I know that there can be uncertainty about the speed and outcome of chemical reactions, and about the accuracy of measurement and the interpretation of data. But for me, the biggest area of concern is the uncertainty associated with communication. Meanings are very context dependent. Words can mean different things to different people. Words can change their meaning over time. Risk, sustainability, climate are all good examples of that. Words like museum and conservation no longer represent the institutions I was familiar with 25 years ago. I've been asked to make some comments that might be the starting point for a discussion about three things: risk assessment and risk mitigation, the influences of finance and value on preservation strategies, and the evolution of the need for environmental monitoring in the light of climate change. And although cultural heritage can be found in many different forms and different locations, I shall stick to the heritage I know, that is museums open to the public, packed with stuff. Point one then, risk.
Just sorry for the beeping, that's my phone. It's just chiming the time, so it will only happen once. Apologise for that.
Right.
Yeah,
I don't believe I've had 5 minutes.
Sorry.
Okay, point one of the round of the things I was asked to discuss. Well, risk assessment, blah, 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 blah. And, okay, point one, risk. When I'm asked for a definition of risk assessment, I'd say, guess about what could go wrong with your business plan. Now, if your business is solely about the welfare and longevity of historic artifacts, then the risks that can be controlled by people working within the museum are the traditional agents of deterioration such as light, temperature, humidity, and pollution. And this control is best informed by extensive monitoring. However, there are numerous hazards that cannot be directly controlled by museum staff, such as weather and warfare. If your museum business is more than just keeping historic objects in a static state, you will have to consider what you actually need to run that business. In addition to collections, buildings and specialist staff, you need a supportive community and streams of income. You need means of communication and means of physical access. The hazards are numerous, from pandemics to politics, and the worst predictions of the effects of climate change. To quote from the normally dispassionate Guardian newspaper, climate scientists foresee a dystopian future with famines, conflicts and mass migration driven by heat waves, wildfires, floods and storms of an intensity and frequency far beyond those we have already suffered. So point 2, finance and value and strategy. Among the casualties of such dramatic climate change will be the income streams on which the museums depend. Preservation strategies are bound to be influenced by finance or the lack of it. Value, even if we could agree on a meaning, is very context dependent and can be affected by the way objects are used within the museum and on factors outside the museum. I don't see that the value of a collection or of an individual object could be a major influence on strategy. Point 3, environmental monitoring and climate change. Building models show that the predicted changes in outdoor temperature and atmospheric moisture mean that energy demands for the control of indoor environments will change. For museums with poorly insulated envelopes, and that is basically most museums, the energy needs will rise in southern Europe, but will decrease in the north. Environmental monitoring will be needed to check the accuracy of predictive modelling of indoor environments. And if objects continue to be acquired or borrowed from non-conditioned buildings, such as historic houses and churches, environmental monitoring coupled with direct measurement of changes in the state of objects will be needed. Discuss.
Jonathan, thank you very much. That's very good. I'm sure we will discuss, and we will discuss partly also what we should be measuring and why we should be measuring it and things that we aren't doing. And to sort of lead us down that role, or give us a taste of that role, our next speaker is going to be Julie McCann, who's an expert in all things to do with computers and networks and artificial intelligence. And, well, I'm not going to say I don't know what you're going to tell us about. You tell us what you're going to tell us about.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me here today. So I really am a computer scientist. I'm really boring. I'm not going to be very philosophical. So hard cheese, you're going to have to listen to tech talk now. Anyway, so yes, I work in Imperial, just down the road, and I'm in the Department of Computing, and I work on sensors, networks, and so on, and we do throw a little bit of AI in for good measure. So last autumn, I was involved in a project that was working for the government to understand better how we'd be able to implement the electronic trade bill. And what we had was a project that had the hypothesis that paper-based documents could be replaced by electronic trade documents. And how we proved that was a team of us got together. We basically shipped a crate from Hull to Singapore, and on that crate was a bunch of teeny tiny sensors that were able to measure the ambient environment, as I generically call it, across the world. And it wasn't uplinking to satellites, it was basically in an ad hoc way uplinking to any network it could find. So we had lots and lots of tiny radios on the system that was able to shoot around and find a network, so to keep costs really low. And at the same time, what it was doing was we had it talking to a distributed ledger, communicating all that data up to a distributed ledger that was ensuring that the data was valid, because just because I'm measuring something doesn't mean it's true, and doesn't mean it's true through its whole complete journey in life. So we had that up to distributed ledgers, and to do that we had quantum encrypted technologies used to encrypt the data going up. And that's quite interesting. And then we also not only trusted that each part of our crate had little sensors on it, so it wasn't a single sensor per unit. And the sensors themselves calibrated each other to double check that nobody was compromising them. And that had post-quantum encryption on it. So we were on these teeny, and anybody who's played with these devices knows you can't put much compute power onto them if you're down at the small and battery powered. So we had to squish all that down into something tiny. The interesting thing is the compute for the quantum side was quite comical because we couldn't send the key, the quantum generated key, across a normal network because that would break the encryption. So we had to bicycle it across London. So anybody who's into Flann O'Brien will understand that that's quite comic for an Irish girl to say. Okay, now why are you interested in that? The thing is the technology that we built for that happened to be technology that we were working on with Tate and V&A to look at protecting and monitoring cultural pieces, mostly art. And what we were interested in was things that, okay, there's what I would call normal shaped art, and then you can tell I'm not from this field. Normal shaped art, and then weird art, which is like tiny bits of stuff, right? And then tiny bits of stuff is real hard to monitor, as I'm sure you know. So we were trying to look at different ways to keep an eye on it. And it brings us back to the conversation of what's authentic, what's not. If somebody nicks a little, terracotta man from a piece of art. So we were trying to look at different, so we looked at all sorts of new ways of sensing. So I used like Wi-Fi as a sensor and things like that. And so that actually came from that background. Now, one of my questions the Boris gave me was, how can artificial intelligence contribute to preservation efforts? Well, I think this is sort of back to what you were talking about earlier. It's preservation and is what needs to be given to let's say, the viewer. So, for example, augmented reality is becoming much more viable now and will become much, much more when our networks are going to super improve. We're going to get super, super high-speed networks. And obviously, our machine learning AI is getting more powerful to be able to render much better, much more detail that we've ever had before. And to that end, it maybe means that we can retire things back into a more, let's say, an environment that's easier to keep that thing preserved. It also allows us to be able to do things that we haven't done before, where we can correlate one thing to another and maybe better understand some of the history of those kinds of things. And it allows us also to reconstruct things so that the person's looking at it can maybe better understand maybe the meaning behind that as well. We also have the opportunity as AI starts to help with, taking in documents and other forms of inputs that we found clunky before, and then we can use that for better cataloging. And once we've got that, that means we can start to better understand what we have and how they all relate to each other. And it also allows us to do things like more citizen science as well. The other side of it is those of you working in materials and chemistry and so on are starting to see that AI is being used to do discovery science. And that's where we humans have certain ideas of how we're going to do our next experiments and so on, but these are driven by AI now. And these are helping us down paths that we maybe wouldn't have thought of before. And that could be helping us in ways that we haven't thought of for conservation as well. Maybe lower cost ways, maybe more sustainable methods. The next question I was asked was, how do we provide the best, most cost-effective results? I have no idea on the answer to that one. All I know is it really costs to get data into anything, and AI is not going to make that much easier. It's going to make it slightly easier, but not as much as we think. And again, when you've got AI, you've got cloud services to worry about. You've got research and development, employee training, all these new things that you maybe didn't have before. And obviously the legal compliance that you did probably have before, but it gets even worse when AI is in the mix. One of the things that I've noticed is that a cost-effective approach to some of these is to look at open source and to look at open source systems and as a community contribute to those so that you're not getting vendor lock-in, and which these kinds of things typically cause issues in terms of costs. My next question was about challenges in requiring suitable training and testing data for AI specifically. And this is interesting, I thought. if we look at all the different companies that are grabbing data and digitizing data, it is expensive, but we're seeing it happening more and more. And we're starting to produce this data online, but the difficulty is always in producing the metadata, the data that describes this digital form. And that's very difficult because that does include opinion, that does include an awful lot of physical effort, and that's not easy. And it's also very interesting from a legal perspective. Are we legally describing something correctly? What is the legal barriers in terms of that metadata? Now, the advantage of metadata is, though, that it helps us better understand things in terms of being able to do, query processing over at AI and so on. And AI does really rely on this labeling, and that's a very expensive thing. And we have to watch for cultural things in that, because there are certain, let's say, institutions that have hived off their labeling of the data off to countries that are not as well off as this particular country. And there's certain immorality about that. So we have to watch for those kinds of ethical considerations as well. We want to look at things like understanding what we can do with AI, but the interesting thing about, in my opinion, about cultural heritage compared to, say, for example, medical AI processing, is the data is very different. All the data is very different from each other. We don't have these, like, for example, in medical processing, we've got reams and reams and reams of MRI scans that we can shove into a machine learning system, and it can start to do prediction and all these fancy things. Easy for you to automate relatively, easy for you to label relatively, but very difficult if you try to look at the diversity of what makes cultural heritage. I think that's a massive challenge, and to do that accurately and that it makes actual sense is going to be very difficult. Also, there's less funds in this to be able to do this and employ people to do this. So whereas medicine and so on has got much more funds to be able to do those kinds of things. And then, of course, there's questions about ownership and privacy and cultural sensitivity. And of course, we all know about where AI is being used to generate what people are calling art, and that's there's a debate for you there on that. Who owns what in that situation, and so on. In summary, I would say we want to be able to strike a balance between the technological achievement and cultural respect. And we have to ask ourselves a question: how do we maintain something that we want to last forever, using computer systems that last at best 10 years?
Thank you, Julie. That's very thoughtful. I discovered only 1 or 2 days ago that if you generate a piece of art with ChatGPT, that you get the copyright. It's amazing.
There you
so
go.
You say there, give me a picture in the style of showing something or other, and a picture comes out, and it's your copyright. So, interesting. I thought it was very interesting, especially because I don't know if it really is your copyright, especially as these things are, we'll go into that later. Jane, you're up next, and I think you're going to perhaps put back a little bit of community into collection. Is that what you want to talk about? It was one of the questions we asked you. We asked you about uncertainty and things like that too. But of course, you're free to discuss whatever you wish, and the floor is yours.
And thank you, Boris. So I was given uncertainty and data, and I'm fairly sure that I've not put those two words together in the way that was intended. But there we are. I wanted to start on uncertainty. It's something I'm very interested in, like Jonathan. And I think the thing that, if we're going to talk about cultural heritage, that I think I'd like us to focus on when we think about uncertainty, is that the opportunities of the future may never happen. So when we're imagining what we're going to do with our cultural heritage and our art, we often stake so much on the future. But if we're going to take uncertainty on board, we have to actually question that future, whether it will be devastated by climate change, whether it will look anything like we see it today. Now, how do we effectively manage uncertainty? Again, I was asked that, and I think it was probably meant to be about maths, but I'm absolutely useless at maths. I've got my son for that. But I think if you're going to manage uncertainty, I think there are two things you have to do. One is acceptance, and the other is organize. And I'll come back to acceptance. But if you're going to organize your uncertainty, then I think some of the questions you can ask first is, can this question be solved? Because there are many questions that can't be solved. But if you are going to be able to solve that question, you also have to ask, will solving that question generate sufficient benefits to justify all the effort we've put into finding out? And also, can it be solved within the resources and the constraints under which we're operating, with the time and the equipment and the space that we're in? So that's the first way of managing our uncertainty, working out what possibility there is for answering, for reducing it. But we can never get rid of all the uncertainty, and that's why we have to work with acceptance. And I think acceptance is so important, because if you characterize uncertainty as a problem, which most politicians do, then you are left always in an unhappy condition. You're always worried, you're always stressed, and goodness me, conservatives have enough stress as it is. So instead of seeing uncertainty as a stress, as a problem, I think what we should be doing is understanding that uncertainty exists, and instead of worrying about the problems, look at the opportunities. Don't ask about what you can find out, but ask what might happen. What are the possibilities? And living in a world of possibilities is so much more fun. So let's look at the possibilities, and when we're examining possibilities, that gives us an opportunity to be creative. It gives us a chance to be curious, and it gives us a chance to ask questions, not just of ourselves, but of the people around us, the people for whom we're keeping that cultural heritage. And this does lead me onto data, which was the other question I was given. Because in my opinion, good data comes from good questions. So yes, if you are going to collect data professionally, ideally using some of the Bevat lockers, I imagine, then for that data to be valuable, it has to have a degree of technical credibility. That's important. In order to be credible and have credible data, which I think was one of my questions, then the first thing you have to do is not to undermine your own credibility. So that means you have to do the basics. You have to make sure you've done calibration. It means that you have to correlate against standards. It means you need to compare to benchmarks. It means that you need to understand the difference between precision and that you can do repetition and you can express the uncertainty in a way that's meaningful. And it also, I think, you need the validation of your peers and experts. But I'm not sure, beyond your peers and experts, how important data actually is. I think that we have to also be careful not to overwork our data. Because really, when you're looking at data, I would encourage us always to go back to what was the question and how does this data address it? Let's resist the urge to focus on just how much hard work it was to collect it. Let's focus not on just how pleased we are with all our graphs and just how delighted we were that we managed to get the line, to do the line thing that we were so hoping for, and the little 0.5 thing to be less, and Stefan's zeros to be the right amount of zeros. Because really the data is only of value if it answers the question. I was asked to talk about data models, so I'm going to say, and that's exactly the same for data models. So for me, when we're looking at the credibility and the reliability of the data, I would say that your reliability of your data doesn't have a very strong link with your credibility. And unfortunately, it also doesn't have a very strong link with influence. It should, in a better world, but we know that it's not what should matter to people, it's what does matter to people. So let's return to uncertainty. Let's return to our questions. Let's ask what assumptions we're carrying, whose perspective we're representing. At some level, that can be technical. We might be thinking about relative humidity. They might be thinking about temperature. We might say plus or minus 5 and not realize it means something completely different than 50 to 60 to somebody else. We might think of a store as not being occupied, and the person trying to pump air into it has never occurred to them you have a non-occupied space. So there are technical things, technical assumptions that we have to work with. But there are other questions and assumptions that we have to work with, social ones. Things like, are we making an assumption that decay is a bad thing? Are we making an assumption that we need to keep things forever? Are we making assumptions about the value of permanence, or even of its existence? And are we making an assumption that authenticity is in some way related to tangible qualities? To me, your data is as good as the answers that it gives to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. I think that's very interesting, because I always thought of data as something that I gather to answer my questions, but that's there before, and you're saying the data is defined by the questions you're trying to answer.
I would say, yeah.
Which is interesting. I find that very interesting. We shall discuss that later. To round off this very interesting discussion, we've got Stefan Simon, who does a lot with a sort of action called Culture in Crisis. Talks a lot about risks which are other than, is the temperature right in this museum? Is the RH fluctuating too much? And it's really that embodiment of Stefan's opinions that I was hoping he would bring to us. I'm not sure what he's going to bring to us, but I'm hoping, I am relying on the fact, I am certain it will be slightly controversial and will be good to raise the discussion. After Stefan, we will open the floor to questions. We'll take one or two, and we will carry on the discussion, the pertinent points. So Stefan, please round off our discussion.
Thank you.
With some controversial points.
Now you mentioned the word controversial 3 times, so it's really a hard, I try my best. But yeah, thank you for the invitation, thank you for having me. I was looking forward very much to come here to London because some of my colleagues I know from the literature, my guiding stars for like 20 years in my work, you know. And Stefan, I also know more than 30 years, so like really, I thought I come here, I can learn a lot. I didn't really come here to say controversial things, but since I'm supposed to do, I have to work with my battery here. Yeah. And thank you for saying that this is your cell phone, because I was getting really nervous that I thought one of my cell phones is making a noise, and I really didn't know how to turn it off. So much about uncertainty. But I was asked, to what extent does climate change impact the deterioration of cultural heritage? And I thought, this is like really a no-brainer, right? I mean, this is what I do, and which I deliberately decided not to do anything else anymore than work on the question of climate change and crisis and heritage. And I don't know where really to start with my 5 minutes, already 2 gone, with the data, because for most of my career, 30 years, I was believing that the preservation of heritage, the survival of heritage is linked to numbers, is linked to the height of a flood wave, is linked to the strength of an earthquake. And only in the last 5 or 10 years I learned that disaster is a totally social construct. It has nothing to do with these numbers. And this is hard for a scientist to admit, because I was actually learning how to measure things for all of my life. And then I realized maybe that's not really the key thing. So about the climate change, I wrote down that, thank you, controversial, right? It will affect everything and everyone. And it will change everything what we are familiar with. Nothing will remain untouched. And the question is only the scale of the change and the timeline a little bit. But that it's changing everything, it's clear. I have been quoted in German media and the United States media sometimes with a very nice quote, which is stating that we will not need any museums anymore if there's no society who would want to visit these museums. And people were looking at me and they said, well, really? That's a kind of a grim outlook, like Mr. Doomsday. And I said, yes, but we're definitely walking blindfolded into a minefield, also in the cultural sector. And what I can say for the museums in Germany, in the United States, but probably also here, is we are not at all prepared, or not even starting to prepare, to what's going to come and it's going to wait for us around the corner. So we should monitor, for example, what we should monitor, right? Flood maps, risk maps, severe weather risks. I can tell you the biggest risk related to climate change for the Berlin National Museum is a risk which nobody has on the radar, not my Director General, not the President of the Foundation, not the Minister of Culture, Claudia Roth, nobody. I was asking them, what do you think is the biggest risk for Berlin? We have no earthquakes, we have no floods, tornadoes. And when I mentioned the word tornado, there was not a single person who said, oh yeah, clear. They all said, really? This is not something from Oklahoma or like Berlin? So, you know, we need to monitor things. And I was also asked this question about what to monitor. Of course, temperature, humidity, acoustic emissions, smoke, water. Of course, we do that. And actually, I think, because it's controversial, I take this up a second time. I think it's totally unethical for a museum to ask for more narrow climate corridors when they're lending out artworks than those that are providing them themselves in their own institution. I think this is totally unethical. I hear that there's discussions in the UK where this proof of evidence is about to be reversed, that you can only ask for conditions which you're able to provide at home. It sounds logical to me. It's not the case in the world because, you know, all these groups are requesting climate corridors which are way more narrow than they are actually able to provide. We are doing for the German Minister of Culture what we call climate benchmarking. So it's 2 years. And I have measured or evaluated more than 200 museums now from Germany, also France, different countries, also South Africa, China. 5 are able to provide ASHRAE A climate. The vast majority doesn't even comply with the Gwiso Green Protocol. But in the loan agreement, it says we have to have a 5% plus minus 5 RH, right? And this is, in my opinion, unethical. So if that's controversial enough, I'm fine with my 5 minutes. So and leave the rest, the community engagement, for later. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. So I'd like to thank all the panelists for their opening statements. They have taken rather longer than 5 minutes each, so much for timekeeping. But I thought it was very interesting to keep them all going. We will carry on a little bit. So we have an hour social program, and I'm going to eat into that with your permission anyway, so that we will get the discussion going a bit more. I will, boo, boo. If the panelists don't mind too much.
I think there should be equity for the audience and not just us talking.
Well, the audience will now get to ask questions. I have some questions I'd like to ask, but I'm going to put them aside. I was going to ask about authenticity and facsimiles, and particularly as they get better and better and better, but I won't. And I was going to ask about discounting value for future generations to get your risk model if we don't know we're going to have future generations, because actually in 10 years' time, who knows what's going to happen. But I won't even ask that. Instead, I would like now to open the floor to the audience to ask some questions. We have a microphone at the front. Christian, you're going to... So if anybody has a burning question for any or all of the panelists, please ask. And can I just say, before you ask, can you just state your name, if you don't mind, state your name and your affiliation. If you do mind, then don't state it, but it would be helpful if you do.
Thank you. It's been absolutely fascinating. My name is Josep Grau from University College London. It's been very interesting to hear all these ideas about uncertainty and how to prevent the reduction or the loss of lifetime of our collections. And I'm wondering about the end of these lifetimes. How much do we know about end-of-lifetime processes and how they are perceived by our publics? Do we understand the public relationship to loss and the mourning that emerges from it? And maybe should we be better prepared to understand these processes if some of them are going to be unavoidable? I don't know who the question is for.
I'm going to pose it first because you're next to me, to you, Stefan. You can.
No, I think it's a very nice study in our literature that was, the team was led by Matthias Strilik, who you would know, of course, and people from National Archives and so on. It was a 3-part article on damage functions and deterioration of paper using really nice accumulation of data on paper aging, but also looking at how people respond to slow damage from the object, and also that they did more on that than they actually published. What they published mostly was how many handlings did it take for pieces to start falling off an archival document, and when did that become a significant loss. But I know there was a whole kind of almost ethnographic body of study where they're asking researchers, what's your attitude towards this paper document yellowing or becoming dirty or losing pieces, how much loss of value to you? And of course it depended on the utility to the person who was looking at it, from people that were just in awe of it because it's magical that there's this old document that some monk did, or someone who's purely in it for the information to do a sociological model. So I agree with you, it would be nice to have more of that kind of study about what the general public actually thinks. I went through a lot of the literature on authenticity where there are studies where the people that do museum survey literature did ask people, and depending on the type of museum, there was one exhibit in a German museum where there were replicas of astronauts' costume uniforms, which it was not explained at the case, and then they asked people afterwards, I'm going to tell you that that was a replica. Does that change your response? And large numbers of people said no. It was a replica of an astronaut uniform was somehow not a big issue. But I know other literature where if you tell people the whole drama in Italy over whether the bronze doors are authentic, and when the government said no, we're replacing them because the old ones are dying, or the horse, Augustus' horse in Rome. But okay, to answer your question, it would be nice to know more, but I think we do have literature which says they're not happy about these transformations and losses. And on the other hand, Agnes Brockerhoff did a whole thing on loss of fading and how important that is, and people actually would say this is an acceptable degree of fading. So there was a study on what's an acceptable degree of light fading, because I used to lecture a lot on light fading, and the first thing I would notice is that if you asked a conservator how many years should this last before a just noticeable fade, they really didn't want to answer the question. They would do anything but answer the question. I mean, excuses, this, that. I mean, and then I realized they're ducking the question. They don't want to say, yes, this is an acceptable degree of damage and this object has a finite lifetime. But Agnes did a nice study on it. People are realistic. Most people are pretty pragmatic.
On that note, we defined it on the V&A paper I did with Jonathan allowed me to work on with him, where we said 2 generations, 50 years, and that was just because we knew that we wouldn't be there in 50 years' time, so nobody could blame us, which is, a good answer, I think.
Yeah, it was totally mathematical.
Yes, of course it was.
Generation equals 25 years, 2 of them is 50 years, come on.
And we were nearly there for 50 years, each of us, so we would have been wrong on both of those things anyway. I think part of the question that, I don't know, I'm probably paraphrasing, but part of the question is, does the value change? Is there a sort of increase in value? That would be a question to me. As things become more damaged and less accessible, do they become more valuable to people or not? I think, Jane, because you're next along the line, maybe I'll pass that to you.
So I'm going to have to keep saying I think that loss and when something is over is basically a value question. And I think that conservators who say that they won't say how long before it can be faded might be actually thinking perhaps it's somebody else's values that we should be listening to. Perhaps it's our museum visitors, perhaps it's the taxpayers in our country, perhaps it's, the people who are making decisions for us. And perhaps that is a discussion that should be opened up. I think that the thing that we shouldn't do is get locked into some kind of eternity, perpetuity, forever. Because we see with Notre Dame, we see with the floods, we see that we don't get to keep things forever. And we know that we don't get keep things forever. But if the service of keeping things forever, or the imagined service of keeping things forever, means that we create climate corridors, that means that lots of people don't get access, then actually what we're doing is exclusion. What we're doing is we're preventing people from benefiting from that culture and heritage. I think people are perfectly sophisticated and engaging. If you look at the Matthias study, it was about usability with the archives. In the archives, although in the historic house, it was something different. It was a more intangible association, and you could see the difference that people put on value. So I think that we should much more engage in questions when we work with our objects. How long are we keeping this for? What's our best guess at this point? On collecting this artifact, what is the projection in which we're keeping it? Because by asking that question, if we collect something made of PVC, something that's been recently collected at the National Museum of Wales, is a PVC Pride banner from the first ever Pride March in Barry. It is not going to be usable in 100 years. End of. So it doesn't matter what we do. Why not get it out once a year and march around behind it? Why try to stretch the life out? Why not discuss what is the value of this to us, and telling us about when we had our first Pride March in Barry, and what that means to us, and hoping, and I suspect knowing museum people as I do, that in 100 years' time we've collected some more things that we can use and share and enjoy. So I think that loss, value, these are cultural things. I'm not sure. I think it's for conservators to ask the questions, not for us to necessarily try to eke things out forever.
Stefan, you've got your finger up. Does that mean you want to be next to...
Yes, I would like to follow what Jane said, because, and Stefan already mentioned, nobody wants to accept loss, and nobody really wants to say we want to lose something, but if you look at, for example, how many, let's say, Italian Renaissance paintings are still around, among all of them which have been painted, so what would be your guess? Well, as literature saying, like 3 to 4% are still here. And these are the lucky ones, they're not the best ones, just the lucky ones, which were not burning in a house or falling into a river, or just the lucky ones are still here. But we think when we go to the museum, this is Italian Renaissance painting, right? So this is one thing. And the other thing about the loss, which I would like to add, and as Jane said, everything changes. I mean, just have to look in the mirror in the morning when you wake up. Everything on this planet changes. Everything. As Leonardo da Vinci said, with water and time, right? So everything changes. But we think that we have this view of our, European, way of the treasures in our museums. And I want to mention my experience and my takeaway message from working with indigenous communities in North America, with Native Americans. There's a totally different perception of preservation, totally different. For us, preservation is put this thing into a display case, never touch it again, and wear and tear is not happening. For Native American communities, using objects is actually preserving, is exactly the opposite. So you can't really reconcile this Western concept of preservation with the indigenous concept of preservation. But what I learned from there, and I think that's very, very clear to me, without these communities, there is no preservation. There is no preservation at all. Putting things into a museum where actually more than half of the world can never see them because they don't get a visa, right, to get there, and mostly from those countries actually also, it's not preservation. It's not preservation. We need to. I mean, we see it also, and maybe just at this point also to draw our attention for a moment to what happens in Ukraine. Cultural heritage is very close to the heart of human identity, and if you really want to destroy the other, you destroy cultural heritage. As of April 10, I think 350 cultural heritage sites in Ukraine have been destroyed, deliberately destroyed, 130 churches, and so on. That's not by accident. This is intentional, right? So I really have a very low patience discussing with my, I mean, I work in the National Museum, I have to make these discussions, but about fading dyes, right? I mean, what happened in September 2018 in Rio de Janeiro, 20 million objects burned overnight. That's loss. What happens in Ukraine every day, that's loss. And this is what touches me, and everything else, that's why I don't have to, it's not a secret. I don't like HVAC systems. They're not sustainable. They're costing a lot of money. They are just putting our Earth Overshoot Day. In Europe, it was just, actually in Germany, it was on May 2nd. Again, 2 days earlier than last year. Last year, it was 4th of May. So that means by 2nd of May, we already use all our German resources which we have. And the rest of, since like a week, we live at the cost of our children, grandchildren, and the people in the global south. I don't like that. So I don't like HVAC systems. I don't like this museum talk. But I want to talk about what is loss and that we have to accept it. It's coming. And we have to also accept there is a different perception of what preservation can be. Our traditional, European or American way and the indigenous way, which I think is more healthy at the end of the day.
Please.
I thought it'd be nice. Following on what Stefan said, and also thinking, how can I link to our gracious financial support to who are not BP, mercifully, but are BevArt. I would like to see monitoring equipment flipped on its head in terms of its purpose. Most people assume I buy monitoring equipment in order to establish I've got a flat line, or that I need to bug the facilities manager for HVAC. I would like it turned around to be, we know that if people were also watching their artifacts and had really good climate control data, we could genuinely use collections across the world as kind of guinea pigs to say, like, we know they tolerate wider limits. How much will they tolerate? People just went, I'm buying this stuff so I can see how bad my environment is in terms of my working assumption, it's bad. And people will find that there are a wide range of fluctuations if they're accurately, without too much uncertainty, measured. And then you would ask the conservators not to focus on looking at the graph so much as doing condition monitoring of the objects to see whether the cracks grew any longer or whether the thing is actually getting bigger or smaller. There are bits and pieces of that in the literature, but I'm just throwing that out. It would be unfortunate if we end up concluding that all of us agree that the buying monitoring equipment is somehow a meaningless and frustrating exercise. I think it can become a very constructive exercise for risk assessment, risk analysis by showing collectively that our collections tolerate much wider limits, much more sustainable climates, much more seasonally fluctuating climates than we tend to believe. And the most powerful data is not going to be me doing scientific experiments with model paintings. Model paintings virtual or model paintings made up with real stuff. The community basically never really buys into that data. The only thing they buy into will be what happens in epidemiology. These are the situations that these collections are in, and these are the number of the ones that get sick or ill or fall apart. That would be an incredibly powerful use of these equipment.
Julie, I'm looking at you now to tell us how you can do this, maybe with artificial intelligence, neural networks, or other, bring together this dispersed amount of data, which is out there.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, you were talking about the HVAC. The actual monitoring systems themselves do cost the earth too. I mean, the materials go into them, the networks and so on. And we're very conscious that the data centers and how much power they're using, cooling and so on. And as a community of computer scientists, we are looking at this. We're looking at how we can reduce that footprint as much as anybody else on the planet. But we are contributing a fair bit. So we're looking at alternatives. Now, one of the alternatives could be in the situation if you're monitoring a piece of work, that, yeah, you're looking at the cracks and seeing its resilience, but also that can infer something of what's going on in the environment more generally, and that information could go towards other scientists, climate scientists, understanding what's really happening at finer grain detail. So the data is being used twice, essentially, the same data. So you might get value in that. The other is alternatives. Looking at alternatives to, the material. So some of the stuff that we've been looking at is repurposing Wi-Fi signals in the environment, and mostly to monitor anything that's a bit wet. So that'd be humans or animals or objects. We can monitor objects and stuff like that without adding any sensors to the environment. The Wi-Fi's there anyway. So this recycling of what exists is something in our field that we're starting to look at, and because it does cost, and we can't avoid that cost essentially.
Jonathan, you're the only one who hasn't had a go. You don't have to, but if you would like to.
What do you want to talk about? I could talk about loss.
Or we can take another question, but let's talk about loss.
No, I was just going to say I have personal experience of loss. In my first month as a practical conservator, I destroyed an object.
This is top secret, by the way.
And I spent my lunchtime making a replica and just handed it in, and nothing has happened since.
But it will now.
Is it more valuable?
I would say now.
Now, yeah.
Work by a saint, I think, is probably...
I believe it was part of a doll's house, so I think a doll's house worked by a saint.
It didn't have to be the Queen still.
But yeah, but now worked by a saint, I think is important. We are eating more into time. I will take one more question, I think, because I think it's very interesting to have a proper answer rather than just very short answers. So is there anybody who has one significant question they would like to? We have Charis. So please state your name and your affiliation, and then.
Charis Theodorakopoulos, Conservation Science from Hamburg University, and I don't know how some people my question would be, but just very quickly, from all right, thank you. So I'm not going to repeat. I hope you heard what I said. So very quickly, most of the studies that we've done on objects and the relation with the environment is based on a static environment. So we can do some damage assessment, and based on that damage assessment, we can make fantastic decisions on designing conservation or changing a little bit, tweaking the microclimate indoors and so on. But I've not seen many studies on the progression of the climate change within an environment. So, because I'm just asking that, I'm just putting that as an idea to discuss, because you know, climate change is already happening. It's not something that will happen in the future. It's happening. And we all think about the collections in a museum or you know, some sort of heritage object which is outdoors and so on. For the environment that we measure now. But we've never thought about, or maybe we thought about it, but I just want to put that in the floor, discussing about what's happening in the rate of that deterioration changing right now. And maybe that has something to do with the prediction of the lifespan of the materials that makes sort of the tangible heritage that we all are concerned with.
Stefan, could I start with you to answer that?
Thank you.
They are in the European research funding, like STEP and Environment in the 90s. There were projects like Noah's Ark, or for example, Culture for Climate, where actually I would, which is, and don't like to do that, but I would oppose what Jonathan said about the south and the north, and like comforting the Norwegians that will be really nice for them. The Culture for Climate, or Climate for Culture, they actually found out that these various scenarios of climate change will lead to much higher microbiological problems in Scandinavia. In churches, in paintings, which they didn't have because it was getting cold in the winter and it was like all the time cold and warm in the summer. But this elevation of higher temperatures will actually cause much more microbiological weathering for cultural heritage in Scandinavia. Just one point. And of course, not mentioning the degree of severe weather events, right? I mean, we can see that actually, as you say, right now. We had a rainstorm in Berlin on June 23rd last year, where we have 17 museums. In 12 of the 17 museums, we have water floods, also in my institute, which we have never had that before. So yeah, there are, you know, more and more European projects on that. And actually also, we spoke about that briefly in the beginning, Norway has, with researchers like Annika Haugen and others, they do a lot of research in the Greenland and the Scandinavian areas for not only rising seawater levels, but also all the other consequences adapted to the various climate change scenarios.
Yes, please.
Please.
No, sorry, I was a part of the Climate for Culture project, and at the end, which is quite a long time ago now, 2014, we tried to write up something, and one of the students involved wrote something about the uncertainties involved, and he concluded that the uncertainties are too great to make any great predictions about anything. And he was told, we've just spent 5 million euros on this project. You're not allowed to say that. And so a slightly modified paper was signed, was written, and the names of several of the people researching were put on it, including mine. But uncertainty was at that time still a major issue about what will happen next.
So I think we can say we remain uncertain about what will happen, but what we know is something will happen. Is that a fair statement, Stefan, in your...
No, we know what will happen. I mean, Fourier 200 years ago discovered that there is the atmosphere transmitting the short wavelengths and not the long wavelengths, so we're heating up. Arrhenius in 1896 correlated the CO2 content with the warming. We have now a concrete basis of the man-made, I mean, there's Nobel Awards going for that. Since the President Johnson paper, it was 1960s, we kind of know that. We have had in the last year from March 23 to March 24, the highest ever rise on Mauna Loa with the 4.7 ppm CO2. We're at just about 423. When I went to school, actually, I learned at 300 ppm. It's like the CO2 content, right? 427 now in April. There's no uncertainty about that. We know it's simple physics applies to everybody, right? So the physics is there. So it's heating up. And what does it mean? More water is evaporating from the ocean. The atmosphere, the warmer atmosphere can keep more water. And it's raining down in the Ahrtal, killing 190 people in June 21 in Germany. You have never heard of that, right? That happens in the global north in one night. And all we know is that this was not the last one. There will be more Ahrtal, and there will be more severe weather events, and there will be more museums flooded. I think that we just don't know yet how quickly Tuvalu will drown, right? We don't know, but it will drown.
On that very cheerful note, I think we now need to conclude the discussion. We have 40 minutes left, I think, for a sort of for eating some canapes and for mingling with each other. I'm going to ask the ambassador whether we might be extending that for another 10 minutes. So we have the privilege of staying 10 minutes late. I'd like to thank personally, and I'd like the audience to thank as well, our very esteemed panel for the very interesting discussion we've had tonight. So thank you all. Thank you for coming, and thank you for accepting the challenge of talking on these points as you have done so well. Thank you very much.